Hello, and welcome back to our Funding and Coastal Resiliency series. We're here to bring you a little summer session. We know we touched base back in June, and from that, we heard some feedback that you want some more information about designs and the implementation of what natural infrastructure projects look like. So we're going to kick this off. And we've got our team here with us today, so they'll be joining in the background, some guest speakers that we're bringing to you. But I want to back up a little bit and just touch base on what we've been talking about so far through this series and how these connections interplay. We brought a lot of information to you about funding programs that overarching themes with natural infrastructure or green stormwater infrastructure. You can address multiple priority projects. You get a lot of benefits by implementing nature-based infrastructure projects. You can also bring in the collaboration, and through that, you can see how you can leveraging your funding with your limited capacity as well, and kind of help bridge those gaps from reducing the cost on any single municipality or community. So we've talked about how green infrastructure has multiple benefits and they can address those priority concerns and have long-term resilience, but you need to know more what they look like, how they work, and how they do provide those long-term resilience benefits. So here with us today for our summer agenda is Adam Bichel. He is a coastal engineering specialist with the University of Wisconsin Sea Grant. And then joining us a little bit later will be Lydia Solis. She's from CALM, the Collaborative Action for Lake Michigan, which I know some of you participate on with Econ, University of Wisconsin Sea Grant. They're both going to bring some examples of what those natural-based infrastructure projects look like in our communities along the Lakeshore. Just to let you know that this is pre-recorded. We did that just to give you some time over the next couple of weeks to view this video over your leisure. We will then touch base again for some office hours on Wednesday, August 17th at 11 a.m. You'll receive an invite to your calendars, but mark that coming up. It's just a drop-in hour, so drop in, ask questions. Our presenters will be there. You can ask them questions or ask our team questions about any of the funding approaches that you've been discovering. Don't forget those links are in your resource box. So our team, Jeff Odafe from American Rivers, you guys met these folks in June, Janet Clements with Water Econ, and Caroline Kosh with Water Now Alliance, and Lead Reed with Water 365 will be joining us just for some discussion and maybe ask some questions to our presenters today. So we are going to talk about natural infrastructure, and you may hear some interplay on those terms. Green stormwater infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, and the new trending term, living shorelines, right? NOAA defines that as practices that uses plants, rocks, and trees to kind of protect and restore your shorelines. You can find some of those resources that we'll be talking about today at the Wisconsin's coastalresilience.org website. But I wanted to reframe so that we all understood kind of those interplay on terms and what we mean by those options. So without further ado, Adam, I'm going to kick it over to you, and you can start us off on what natural-based shoreline looks like in Wisconsin.
Thanks, Shannon. In this, I'm going to be talking about a recently published guide called Nature-Based Shoreline Options for the Great Lakes Coasts. And first, I want to start by acknowledging my co-authors on this guide, Brianna Shea and Jean Clark. And so what we tried to do with this guide was kind of give a broad overview of the different types of these sort of nature-based shorelines that have been used in the Great Lakes, focusing on Wisconsin, obviously, but really to give an overview of what types of these nature-based shoreline options work in the Great Lakes. And so this was a guide that came out of a collaborative project funded by the NOAA Coastal Resilience Grants Program in cooperation with the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program, the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, Wisconsin Sea Grant, and UW-Madison College of Engineering. So what we used kind of as a guiding definition for this guide was nature-based shorelines use or mimic natural features to stabilize the coast. So building on kind of what Shannon had mentioned, vegetation, trees, other natural features, kind of living or non-living on the shoreline. So you can find this guide, as Shannon said, at wicoastalresilience.org, or use your favorite search engine, type in Great Lakes nature-based shorelines, should take you to this page where you can download the PDF. So kind of taking a step back, thinking about our Great Lakes coasts and what sort of shore protection options exist when we're dealing with flooding and erosion. There's sort of a gray to green spectrum of shore protection. This is a figure from the Army Corps of Engineers, their SAGE systems approach to geomorphic engineering, where on the left-hand side we have our greener techniques and our right-hand side we have our grayer or harder techniques. And so there's, as Shannon mentioned, a lot of different terms kind of used for these approaches. We use nature-based shorelines for this guide, living shorelines, coastal green infrastructure, natural nature-based features. Army Corps uses engineering with nature and has a large program looking at sort of these more elements of green shore protection. On the other side of the spectrum, we have things like coastal structures, hard armoring, gray infrastructure, those sorts of terms. And so when we're talking to people about nature-based shorelines, there is guidance out there, such as this this graphic, but it's really focused a lot on our salty coasts. A lot of those methods, some can apply, some don't. Obviously, we don't have oyster beds or mangroves that grow in the Great Lakes, so we really wanted to give a view of what nature-based shorelines could look like in the Great Lakes. Why would we want to start thinking of nature-based shorelines? There's a lot of benefits. Nature-based shorelines can create or improve habitat. Water quality improvements with having vegetation can help filter stormwater. You can use hybrid approaches where you have nature-based elements and some of your more traditional gray elements like rock. Aesthetic enhancements, showing in these two pictures, this kind of failing steel sheet pile wall was replaced by a nature-based shoreline that I'll describe further. But I think most people would prefer the aesthetic of the more natural shoreline. And in this case, public access might be easier, being able to kind of see and feel the water and interact with it a little bit better. And in some cases, not all costs of nature-based shorelines may be lower. There are challenges, particularly for the Great Lakes. A lot of our Great Lakes shoreline is exposed to high wave energy, which can make nature-based shorelines challenging. There are ice impacts. We live in a cold climate, and ice can certainly be a challenge to getting things like vegetation to establish. We have large water level fluctuations, as we recently saw in Lake Michigan, over 6 feet between record highs and record lows, and being able to find vegetation and other nature-based elements that can adapt to that is a challenge. Cold regions, we have a short growing season, so things like starting plants in greenhouses and really trying to adapt those living elements to that short growing season need to be thought about. There's maintenance needs that maybe you don't have with a classic gray infrastructure. Getting rid of invasive species, replacing plants that have died off. Those sorts of things may be new. And these are emerging practices in the Great Lakes. They're a little bit more developed in our salty coasts. So things like finding contractors and engineers that are familiar with these approaches and comfortable with them, working with permitting agencies on emerging practices can be a challenge, certainly not insurmountable, but things that sort of separate nature-based shorelines from some of the more classic traditional approaches to shoreline protection that we've seen for a long time on the Great Lakes. So as I said, this guide is intended to be an overview of the different types of nature-based shorelines. It's sort of a survey of what's out there that fits that definition of incorporating natural and nature-based elements. It's not exhaustive of all the specific techniques that could be used, but we did try and break it up into different types. And this is sort of our summary overview, and I'll now go into kind of describing and giving a case study example that we feature in our guide of these different types: vegetation, nourishment, slope stabilization, edging, sills, and ecologically enhanced hard armoring. So our first type of nature-based shoreline is vegetation. This is a native vegetation planted on the shore to reinforce sediments with roots, dissipate wave energy, and slow erosive runoff and wind. And for each of these types, we tried to give a relative ranking, I'll take a step back, of different categories from low to high, for considering environmental benefits, wave energy that these types of shorelines can sort of absorb and be resilient to, the slope that they can survive on. Steep eroding slopes are more limiting to nature-based shorelines than flat gentle slopes. Relative costs and sort of idea about maintenance requirements. Again, these are sort of relative rankings. They're not associated with an absolute value, but really try to give an idea so you can compare and contrast the different elements. For example, wave energy, a low wave energy environment would be a very sheltered embayment versus a high wave energy environment kind of on the exposed open coast of Lake Michigan. So again, vegetation being the first option, really kind of the lowest wave energy environment. Our case study for this was Bradford Beach in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the county installed a series of bioswales around some existing stormwater outfalls. So the bioswales help treat that stormwater runoff and really deal with water quality issues at the beach. And then the bioswales were surrounded by healthy dune vegetation to stabilize those dunes and bioswales. This was a project that had a number of different funding sources and collaborators to make it work, including a pretty large private donation. So really a takeaway here was the need for collaboration and how it really propelled this project forward. An additional example we feature is Wisconsin Point in Superior, Wisconsin, where they did a big dune restoration and provided access points over the vegetation so that it didn't get trampled and could be, live a long life stabilizing those dunes. Next type is nourishment, the placement of clean sediment, often sand on beaches, dunes, or in nearshore waters to replace sand that's lost from erosion or to help build dunes. A lot of times we need to think about how nature is going to shape where this sediment goes. So often we'll have an initial nourishment profile where the sand is placed, and then the waves and the wind will sort of realign that to where it sort of should be to fit that environment. In some cases, this sediment may be sacrificial, so erosion will take it away and move it along the shoreline. But that is part of the nature of nourishment. So you're trying to work with nature again to sort of fit that wave environment. So the case study we featured here was Blue Harbor Beach in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. You can kind of see, if you're familiar with the site, here in 2012, this stone revetment sort of disappeared under the dunes in front of the resort. And there was still a revetment there. It was just buried with sand and nourished with sand and dune vegetation growing on top of it, providing a nice sort of wide beach and beautiful place to visit. When water levels rose, that sand got eroded away, and there you can see that buried revetment kind of providing a backstop of erosion. Certainly could have just gone with the revetment along the coast, but those many years where there was that sort of engineered dune environment would not have been enjoyed, and the habitat that was there for many years would not have been available. Additional example of this was a recent nourishment at Kenosha Dunes State Natural Area. It was part of Army Corps dredging of the Kenosha Harbor. The sand was pumped to the Kenosha Dunes State Natural Area and hydraulically placed on the shoreline. It did serve kind of as sacrificial sediment and providing some temporary shore protection to this eroding site. Our next type is slope stabilization. So this is regrading or reinforcing an eroding, failing bluff, bank, or dune to a stable slope. And this is to allow habitat or vegetation to establish. If a slope is too steep and eroding, it's really hard for vegetation to establish and grow, and there's really not a whole lot of habitat that's possible there. Um, our case study for this is the former University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Chancellor's residence in Shorewood, Wisconsin. This is a picture of the site in 2012. You can see there is somewhat of a rock revetment at the bottom to handle wave energy, but there's a good deal of erosion taking place up by the residence to within about 8 feet of that house, kind of threatening it if that slope were to fail. It's pretty steep right there, and you can tell it's bare, no vegetation. This is what it looked like after the slope stabilization, and I'll kind of walk you through what happened. In this case, they couldn't really cut the slope back to a more stable angle because the house was so close. So they built a vertical living retaining wall, essentially built out of geotextile fabric that's been vegetated. And so you can kind of see that being built. This is what it looks like as a finished product. So instead of maybe a concrete or wood retaining wall, you have this nice, beautiful growing and living um, slope stabilization project there. Another example would be Bender Park in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. This was similarly a eroding bluff that was regraded. You can even see they had a road built down for access, but a beautiful site, lots of healthy native vegetation growing on this regraded slope. Moving on to sort of handling some wave energy, we have edging, which is the placement of coral logs, wood or stone, some material at the toe or base of the shoreline to prevent erosion and allow vegetation to establish. So this is not going to handle the highest wave energy environments, but it is sort of a step up in helping vegetation establish by providing some material to absorb some of that wave energy. Our case study here was Shoreline Park in Sandusky, Ohio. This is a sheltered embayment, but you can see the effects that erosion had on this small embayment. Another issue was geese kind of just loafed right up from the water and made water quality pretty poor here. So what they did was they used some core or coconut fiber logs to sort of start their vegetation restoration. So these coconut fiber logs handled a little bit of that wave energy, and then they were able to revegetate this area, and it's really cut down on the goose problem and looks a lot nicer than the other alternative, which was a small revetment. This was done kind of by staff and volunteers to do this restoration. So another example of how this can be done with collaborators. Additional example would be Best Western in Grand Marais, Minnesota. They have a rock edging backed by vegetation, and this really helps cut down on the amount of sand that gets washed over into the back area here, allowing that vegetation to survive. If it gets covered in sand in a large storm event, that vegetation would have a hard time surviving and not be able to provide that stabilizing benefit. Next is a sill. This is a low profile structure located in the water just off the shoreline to dissipate wave energy and create an area of protected natural marsh. This is a bit smaller than a breakwater, but it is intended to work in concert with the vegetation. So the stone sill breaks a little bit of wave energy, the marsh vegetation and shoreline vegetation handles the rest. The case study example you saw early on is Marysville, Michigan on the St. Clair River. That you can see the rock sill here, marsh vegetation, and then kind of stone edging behind it. This is at low water levels, and you can see at high water levels that sill gets mostly inundated. The marsh is now submerged or emergent, and that edging again can handle that remaining wave energy. This was funded through the GLRI, the City of Marysville, and St. Clair River Area of Concern. So again, a partnership made this project happen. Additional example from Wisconsin Point in Superior, Wisconsin. This was a NOAA-funded project to put in a sill. You can see this sort of in the planting phase. And then as the vegetation is established, there's the rock sill and the marsh vegetation. Final option we came up with was ecologically enhanced hard armoring. This is the use of vegetation, textured surfaces, or other features that are added to kind of conventional hard armoring structures that provide habitat and other benefits, really either where you have an existing gray infrastructure or you really need that something like a breakwater or a revetment to handle the high wave energy. Kind of in the diagram here, we have a breakwater that's sort of sheltering a small marsh or a vegetated revetment. There's been study out of the University of Toledo comparing fish diversity in front of revetments with and without vegetation, and there's big improvements to fish diversity when there is healthy vegetation upland of the revetment. So again, kind of enhancing something that maybe is considered gray infrastructure. Case study we feature is Sam Myers Park in Racine, Wisconsin. There was an existing breakwater here, kind of giving this small embayment. Water quality was a big issue in this embayment. There's poor circulation and a lot of runoff coming in there. Prior to the nature-based shoreline, this was also taken over by Phragmites. Waves were overtopping the breakwater. It wasn't sufficient and really kind of wasn't a very well-used site. They raised the breakwater here, kind of providing additional wave protection, and then took initiative to restore the wetland here, add some green infrastructure, and really address the water quality issue, taking this from a beach that had a swim ban to one that has an offshore swimming area. This was funded by 23 different funding sources, really putting a lot of things together. Major funding sources included the GLRI, the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program, Fund for Lake Michigan, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Root Pike Winds Network. An additional example, a little bit different, is from the Milwaukee Harbor. Here was an experimental project from the Army Corps of Engineers to add kind of smaller stone inside the harbor to provide some fish spawning habitat. Again, that breakwater is going to be there. It's a harbor. It needs to be there to provide that sheltered environment, but sort of enhancing that hard armoring to give some habitat benefits. Again, this is sort of the summary document, kind of comparing these different types of nature-based shorelines for environmental benefits, wave energy, the shoreline slope, their cost and maintenance requirements. And with that, thank you for your attention. And I just want to acknowledge all the folks who contributed to this guide and reviewed it. And again, funding from the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program and the NOAA Coastal Resilience Grants Program. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Those are really great examples and great examples of the collaboration of different funding sources. Sometimes it took to get those projects off the ground and implemented. I know I probably have some questions, but let me open it up to the team to see if they've got questions for you. Looks like Jeff's ready. Go ahead, Jeff.
Adam, thanks so very much. This was really instructive. I want to go back to something you raised towards the beginning of the presentation when you were talking about challenges. And I guess, can you just talk a little bit more about how some of these practices respond to, say, ice and water level fluctuations? And particularly as we're looking forward to those conditions increasing in time or increasing in severity over the coming decades, and thinking a little bit ahead about the adaptation value of nature-based approaches along for shoreline protection.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Ice impacts, I think, definitely is still an active area of research. Just recently saw a NOAA webinar in Maine where they were trying to put in wood that would raft the ice up over the nature-based shoreline. So I think ice is still a challenge that sort of actively trying to come up with new ways to deal with. I think things like making sure if, for example, you have a sill that the stones are large enough to not get plucked when the ice that you might expect there kind of forms and interacts with the structure. The slope, obviously, depending on how steep or how shallow it would be, affects how the ice forces impact the shoreline there. And so I think there's still an active area of research to kind of understand better what sort of shoreline vegetation can withstand those. Some instances you may need woodier, hardier species than you might otherwise want. In terms of water level fluctuations, I think you know, the sill is a good representation of that in this example, where you have different levels of protection for low water levels and high water levels. Obviously, a lot of times you're designing for the highest water levels, but making sure that the different mixture of vegetation is adaptable is key.
Great, thank you. I guess it seems like an emerging area of practice, and folks you're working with or folks we might be working with will be part of that growing of expertise and technique.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, there's not a manual for nature-based shorelines in the Great Lakes or standards of design. So it is a growing area of practice and pulling in knowledge from all over the place, from stream restoration out to the salty coasts, and trying to grow that body of knowledge.
Okay.
Building off of that comment, I think this would be a really good, using this presentation or the guide would be really good for municipalities to kind of gain support for projects that they've identified, because it has all these visuals and they can share that with their, you know, councils and boards and decision makers that have funding decisions to make. So I know folks can go back to the beginning of the recording, but can you go back to the slide that shows how to access the guide? And then is this PowerPoint also available?
Yeah, I can definitely make the PowerPoint available. And you know, all the graphics and things like that are available in the guide, but certainly can make the slides available as a different format. We're also hopefully going to have this appear as a story map as well, with this information to make it, you know, a little different format. And as you mentioned, sort of the visuals and examples, because this is an emerging area, the body of examples is growing, and so there's, you know, a lot of projects underway, maybe are going to be constructed this year or next year. So hopefully we'll be able to keep up those good examples as they come together, because definitely people want to see something that's worked and see where it's come together elsewhere. So
Thanks, Adam.
Yep.
I have a question. You mentioned collaboration several times, or partnerships throughout the presentation. And that's one of the, I guess, key areas that a lot of our members or our folks we're working with are interested in exploring. You know, a lot of people don't have necessarily the time, you know, to look at funding options, things like that. So just wondering if you could elaborate on some of the most successful partnerships that you've seen for, you know, associated with some of these projects, and kind of what the key success factors might be.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, in the guide, we tried to, for each of the case studies, sort of write up some of the major partners, and I think some of the main ones are with permitting agencies, trying to be able to you know, share ideas with them at the get-go, so there's not surprises halfway through the process, as best as possible. I think it was a big one that people shared, just because these, like I said, these are emerging practices. They may be things that folks haven't seen before, so being able to work through those you know, permitting processes together at the beginning, I think has been super helpful for folks. And then, you know, think like local friends groups. I'm thinking in particular of the shoreline Sandusky, volunteer groups and things like that to get them on board and help out, I think was big. And then like local watershed partners and things like that, that might bring in different expertise. I think were critical, as well as state agencies that might have access to federal funding or federal expertise, being able to bring EPA or NOAA into the fold. So thinking of in Wisconsin, things like the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program, the DNR Office of Great Waters, things like that. Trying to kind of get those different levels of government in, so that people who have those connections and knowledge of resources can help bring that to the project.
On that note, oh, sorry, Janet.
No, I'm done.
On the note of the permit and coordinating with the permitting agencies, tell us a little bit more about need for waivers of or special permit conditions, since these are new approaches. How have folks navigated, any barriers in permit requirements or lack of clarity about what BMPs are accepted?
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak to specific examples and statutes and things like that, but one sort of example would be thinking of something like a sill, where to construct it, it is in the water to some extent. It's not far offshore, but it's not at the ordinary high water mark or above the ordinary high water mark. So just being able to address that, it's below the ordinary high water mark, obviously, and trying to be able to weigh sort of those impacts versus the benefits. And I'm not fully aware of any of the challenges or process that would have gone into specifically in this Wisconsin Point project, but I think those sorts of thoughts, as compared to maybe a revetment that's just sort of built adjacent to the shoreline or on the shoreline, this is something that's more in the water.
Maybe we can sneak in one more question. You brought it up in your response to Janet's question about collaboration, and I suspect that part of what you've been doing over the past year or more has been educating funders, whether it's NOAA or other state and federal funders, as well as hopefully like folks like GLRI. Can you tell us a little bit about how funders are starting to think about these nature-based solutions and how receptive they are, or questions they've had, or that kind of engagement?
Yeah, I think there's definite interest in funding, nature-based and natural features. It may show up as priorities in funding calls. And I think part of the education is a lot of the examples that we might see are the ones from maybe the Salt Coast, where it's this mangrove or this it's an area behind a barrier beach, and you can do a vegetated marsh and things like that. And just sort of the reality of a lot of our Great Lakes shorelines, where we are high wave energy, and sometimes nature-based means ecologically enhanced hard armoring. There is the either existing shore protection structure, or there may need to be some sort of hard elements, and sort of the place for where hybrid approaches have benefit, and how that fits into the framework of a living shoreline, or a natural or nature-based shoreline, or excuse me, natural and nature-based feature, I think is sort of something that I've heard from local government partners, is the education need. And so trying to share that and make it, obviously not just put in a revetment and plant a tree above it, but where is that? How do those hybrid solutions work? Where are they needed? And how are they? At what point can they be considered natural nature-based features that do have benefits? And where's the evidence for that?
All very interesting, Adam. And thank you so much for these examples. It's one thing to hear these terms and, know that green infrastructure and nature-based is typically rain gardens, but to see all the different types of approaches as it relates to the actual challenges in the Great Lakes is really interesting. So hopefully that gives us some tidbits to think about. We have Lydia with us now, who's gonna talk about some designs and ideas that we can do for not only private property, but maybe extend them along public spaces and our lakeshore. So Lydia, if you're ready, I'll kick it off to you. You should be able
Yes.
to share your presentation if you need to as well.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. I am going to share my screen now. All right, just double checking that you can see.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I am Lydia Salas. I'm a project coordinator for Wisconsin Coastal Management Program and Wisconsin Sea Grant Institutes. And I'm just going to be piggybacking off of Adam's presentation on the nature-based shorelines guide to share with you another guide that's come out of the Southeastern Wisconsin Coastal Resilience Project, which is a property owner's guide to protecting your bluff. And the dynamic nature of the coastline can make addressing hazards like erosion challenging, especially in the context of high water levels, which can exacerbate the impacts of those hazards. And additionally, there's a range of shoreline types and different amounts of coastal development across Wisconsin's coastal counties, which makes a one-size-fits-all solution to bluff management impossible. So this guide was developed to help coastal bluff property owners be more resilient to the impacts of variable lake levels and climate change, and also to promote the holistic management of coastal bluffs. And so this publication provides property owners with usable information that helps them look at the top, the face, and then the toe of their bluff to assess it for obvious signs of bluff stability problems, and then think through potential management practices to enhance stability. And this includes a list of vegetation that's suitable to enhancing Lake Michigan bluff stability. And so we broke this guide into 6 parts. There's 3 chapters and then 3 appendices. And the chapters are organized in a top-down approach to discuss managing the top, face, then toe of a bluff. And then the appendices address native vegetation options and special cases such as imminent risk and new construction. So the kind of framework for the 3 main chapters are, is there a problem? What are some of those visual indicators there might be a problem? What could be the underlying issue? And then what are different management possibilities that we can explore? And sorry, I should have had that up while I was chatting about it, but that's the contents for the guide. And so I'm just going to walk through each of the chapters and then highlight some of the appendices as well. So first chapter is really just an introduction to living on the Great Lakes coastal bluff. And it provides context for what it means to live in a dynamic environment, the characteristics that influence the stability of a bluff, and the implications in changing the natural environment by adding impervious surfaces. And it also includes kind of this discussion about holistic bluff management from both a coastal processes perspective and a human behavior perspective. And it establishes some guiding principles for the management of the bluff top, face, and toe. And before I show those guiding principles, I just want to mention that human development and management decisions have an impact on bluff stability beyond those naturally occurring processes. So we can kind of see that the human impact up on the top of the bluff in this image, and then all those natural processes impacting the bluff from the lake. And when erosion and bluff stability issues present themselves, people often jump to shore protection structures as the solution without considering, the whole bluff. And so this guide helps users identify what could be the root of their bluff instability and what options they might have to improve stability, as well as incorporating alternative solutions to, protecting and stabilizing the bluff. So, it looks like I pulled out my guiding principles slide, but essentially we'll get to that and you'll see it, you'll see it pop up through here. But really what we're looking for is principles regarding managing land use, as well as water, so surface water and groundwater, and managing vegetation. And then at the end, thinking about toe erosion and stability there. So really those guiding principles are working top down, and that's how this bluff guide was kind of formatted. So the second chapter is where we dive into actual management of the bluff. And so in chapter 2, we're looking at visible bluff top indicators of slope stability issues. And we try to use pictures throughout this guide to help demonstrate what these indicators might look like on Wisconsin's Great Lakes bluffs. And so just at the top image here is a ground crack. And that's something that was actually found on a property on our Lake Michigan bluff. And so those are kind of those visual indicators of some instability. We also have some images of trees that are curved because of some sediment movement on the bluff. And so we're really trying to exemplify what these visual indicators might look like. And then the second section of the chapter walks through bluff top management practices. And each of those practices are categorized for land use, surface water, groundwater, or vegetation management. So we'll see that again in the next chapter. Those are kind of the key categories where property owners can implement practices that will help improve stability. And again, just with that slide, a lot of visuals throughout here. So the third chapter is looking to describe some obvious signs of bluff instability. Now we're moving to the bluff face and the bluff toe. And so as in chapter 2, this chapter highlights those practices that promote bluff stability throughout or through the management of land use, surface and groundwater, and vegetation. And so these practices can be used both bluff face and down at the toe to address stability issues. And at the end of this chapter, if it's deemed necessary to install shore protection structures, we kind of emphasize that these other practices can still be used to enhance stability and help maintain the integrity of shore protection structures. And I caught the end of Adam's presentation, so I want to call back to the ecologically enhanced shore protection structure he called out. So, even if it's determined that a revetment needs to go in, vegetation can still be managed, or bluffs can be cut back to a more stable slope. Groundwater could still be managed, and all those will help address the overall bluff stability issues. And that will really be specific to whatever site that you're looking at. And this chapter also has some considerations for what a well-designed shore protection structure is. And so that's an interesting thing to check out, also as considerations for like checking with your neighbors and what the impacts of that installing a protection structure could be. And so we have some more great visuals here of options for improving bluff face and toe stability, and just some of the engineering behind some of it, like this rock revetment. The picture down at the bottom right of the screen is it was kind of resloped, and they're using these coir logs to help establish some vegetation in this ravine. So the ravine was regraded, filled in, and then they're trying to establish vegetation. Okay, so we utilized the appendices in this guide to address other conditions that are relevant to bluff management. And the first appendix that I'm going to highlight is selecting vegetation for slope stabilization. And this appendix promotes the use of nature-based features to enhance bluff and shoreline stabilization. And I wanted to highlight this section in more detail for you today, since it aligns with the focus of today's theme for the presentations. So there are 3 sections to this appendix. First, there's a background section that discusses characteristics of plant species and indicates how well suited the plant is for enhancing stability. For example, root structure. You know, if a plant has more fibrous roots, really deep roots, those type of plants will be really great at stabilizing. If you have plants that just have kind of a tap root, or their root systems are really small, they might be less effective in certain areas at stabilizing. So there's considerations like that. Additionally, we walk through characteristics that dictate how a specific species may survive and thrive at a site, depending on conditions like soil type, soil moisture, sun exposure, and wildlife stressors, such as deer. So those are all kind of considerations into how well the vegetation will do in certain areas of the bluff. The second section is a series of tables that provide information about native species that are generally suitable for Lake Michigan bluffs. And these are tailored to southeastern Wisconsin, like I mentioned, but a lot of the listed species are also applicable outside of this region. So we just suggest that anyone who's interested in vegetating a bluff check with their local horticulture extension specialists or with nurseries, just to be sure. And when going through these tables, it's to help to select appropriate vegetation, but a lot of that can depend on the stabilization needs of the specific site, the site characteristics. So, you know, is it a really steep bluff? Is it something more shallow? Soil type, things like that. And then the intent and purpose of the space. And so this is really important for folks to think about. If you're trying to create a view shed, well, you might not want to choose trees because first of all, you'd be adding some weight to the end of the bluff there, which bluff edge, which isn't recommended. And then you're blocking your view. So maybe something shorter like shrubs or tall grasses could still provide stability there and fit the intended purpose. So that's just another consideration for putting together the space, you know, your plant list. And then the third section builds off those vegetation tables, and it contains a bunch of photos and descriptions of key species that are provided in the tables. So it just is kind of one step further on a lot of those common native species that we'll find and would be useful for you know, stabilization purposes. So I'll just quickly talk through the next 2 appendices. The imminent risk appendix is intended to help property owners take steps to make their bluff property more stable after they've identified signs of a potential failure. And this guide, you know, as we were looking through all those pictures, can help property owners visually identify those signs that they might be at risk for a failure. And then the appendix kind of takes it to the next step by providing a list of management actions that could be used to help stabilize a bluff that's like at immediate risk of failure. And then it also has contact information for like engineers, geologists that should, you know, be contacted. I said that wrong. There's not a list of engineers and geologists there, but they should be consulted just to make sure that, you know, you figure out what's actually going on at that site. But the contacts that are there listed in that appendix can help with questions about engineering, allowable actions, permitting, and then even help, you know, provide some of that outreach and background about why this is happening in the first place, just that kind of that education piece. All right, and then the third appendix is considerations for new construction. And so this is aimed at those property owners that are considering developing a coastal property that's not already been developed. And we wrote it to help them make decisions that will limit the impact of development on the bluff top or face. And so with this appendix, we're trying to encourage careful planning to help limit the impacts of construction on natural bluff retreat rates, because as you can imagine, it's easier to increase bluff retreat than it is to slow it down. So this is kind of that thoughtful planning piece. And the construction actions and decisions in this appendix range from general earthwork and site location management to groundwater management, surface water management, vegetation management. So there's a variety of practices in there to consider. And this appendix also includes some contacts for local, state, and federal offices to consult and ensure that you're complying with the laws and ordinances that need to be complied with. And so this is free to download. It's online through the Aquatic Science Center publications page. And I just want to, oh my goodness, my guiding principles did not make it in here for some reason. But I just wanted to walk through kind of those guiding principles again of managing the bluff from the top down and thinking about incorporating those other practices such as vegetation and regrading that could help enhance the stability of the bluff, and even if it's deemed necessary to have some sort of structure, can also, help maintain that structure's integrity and also provide some co-benefits to what the structure is providing. And so thinking holistically through the bluff management, and also thinking about controlling and managing for water running over the surface of the bluff and in the bluff. And so I just wanted to mention that while some aspects of the guide specifically target southeastern Wisconsin, such as the vegetation appendix, those guiding principles in the format of the guide can be applied across Wisconsin's Great Lakes coastlines. And the visuals can be used as references for how how those principles have been applied already in the region and how some of those practices have been applied. There's some really great examples in there. If I go back, such as, creating a view shed here and here, having a vegetated buffer. So those are examples of how they've already been incorporated. And additionally, the guide was developed in a way that would help walk property owners through the thought process of managing their bluff, but this framework can be applied and scaled for municipal use as well. And a lot of these practices can be applied at a larger scale. And, for example, establishing view sheds, like I pointed out, buffer strips, mowing practices, slope grading and vegetation management and more can all be utilized at both the property owner level and municipal level. And so I can go back to the thank you slide, but I know you wanted to get some time for questions, so I can take some questions now as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. Those are really great ideas. And I know here on the Michigan side of the lake, it's increasingly amount homeowners are trying to reach out for ways to, stabilize their property as we're getting more erosion problems. So have you seen an increase in just property owners coming to you or using this resource or reaching out to municipalities for ideas?
I do know with the high water levels, there was there was a lot of emergency shore protection that went in. And so we know that there was a lot of need from folks in the communities to protect their bluffs. I personally don't get to talk to too many of the property owners, but I think Adam probably fields a lot of those calls and might be able to say better. But we are hearing from the communities, like municipalities, that they're getting a lot of interest and from their constituents about what to do and what actions they can take and what options are available. So we've been sharing these guides with as many communities as we can, as many presentations as we can, and hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. I'll open it up to the rest of the team. Sorry, I didn't mean to sneak a question in there, but I was curious because we are hearing it a lot. And I think that the time they report it is when there's a big problem, right? When they notice like damage to their property or neighbor's property. And then it's usually like the hard, gray approaches that they get pointed towards. So I just wanted
Mhm.
to know what was happening on your side.
Yeah, and I think initially the project that these guidances and products came out of was meant to be getting ahead of that curve. So thinking ahead instead of being prescriptive. But then water levels rose so much, and so now a lot of our outreach is about next time this happens, how can we be prepared so that we're not waiting until water levels are super high and you're having these massive failures. What can you be doing on your property or in your communities to get ahead of the bluffability issues, at least specifically with this guy.
I like that proactive approaches.
Proactive, yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, up next, I'm sure you guys have some questions for Lydia.
I do. Lydia, I'm very grateful to you for this presentation. Thanks for all of this much and like more, I'm going to say it, and like in the weeds information about nature-based solutions. I think it picks up really nicely from Adam's presentation and takes us to that next level of detail.
Mhm.
And then you touched on this, the applicability of much of this information to municipal partners, which made me think a little bit about collaboration, right? And the potential to really kind of mobilize private property owners as part of a solution that involves community or municipal agencies. So I wonder if you just had thoughts on kind of enabling that, that kind of level of coalition building or cooperation. And have you seen that in action around Wisconsin?
That's a great question. I'm not super plugged into that. And Adam, if you have an answer to that, I would invite you to pop in. But I think, with this, we're trying to do a lot of education to property owners so that they can kind of have all the tools in their tool belt to, realize that this is happening before it's too late and make decisions. I don't know of really any projects where I don't know if this is answering your question, where like property owners are working with the communities, like working together kind of across that boundary. But I do know that, we're trying to get more education and risk communication materials out to them so that they kind of have those tools in their tool belt to make choices. And one of the tricky pieces of that is funding. So, a lot of public funding can't be used for private properties. So that's one of those tricky things.
Actually more than one instance where I've referenced this guide to folks is where there's either friends groups or neighborhood groups that jointly manage or take care of a bluff property or an area adjacent to the bluff property and maybe have different opinions on what is the best way to do that. Should they mow the grass all the way down? And so this has been nice to be able to share as sort of a, science-based approach to like what is the best for bluff stability. There may be other considerations, people's site use and things like that, which we don't have a lot to say over. That's people's decisions. But from a perspective of what's best for the bluff stability, I've been able to share this with folks so they can work together on that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam. That's a really great point.
Yeah, and there is a specific in the third chapter with talking about bluff toe protection and what makes a good, toe protection structure. There is considerations for what's happening to properties around you and working together. So that's one of the things trying to encourage. So at least if you're not able to work with, your neighbors or adjacent properties, onshore protection structures, at least thinking about what those impacts are and how you could mitigate or enhance them.
Yeah, and that on the note, Lydia, thank you for that insight around the cooperation and pathways to working with the municipalities and the importance of private property investments and the ways to address those needs, I would invite us all to think creatively about what public funding can pay for. It's something that Water Now thinks about and talks about a lot about, and has contributed to this workshop series. The idea that you can indeed use public dollars to pay for private property improvements when they are benefiting the community overall. Including in Wisconsin, there are pathways to doing that. Certainly there are some extra questions to answer, but it is a possibility when these investments, as you're saying, do provide an overall public benefit.
That is great to hear. I love creative solutions to that.
Happy to talk with you more about it, but
Yes,
just to make
yes.
that note for the recording and for generally that this is an idea that we think about a lot.
Yeah, totally.
Another interesting approach I saw that was used in Minnesota recently was the soil and water conservation districts were able to get a grant to bring an engineer, hire a consultant engineer to do property inspections with the residents who's expressed concerns and walk through what their options are and sort of help them, at least give them recommendations from the consultant. Didn't do construction, but it was able to provide that level of pooling that public resource to serve all the residents who had contacted them. So another interesting creative approach.
Yes,
Hey,
thanks for
Linda,
jumping
take
in with
note of
that, Al.
Yeah, Linda, that seems like something right up LNRP's alley in yours to engage with the consulting community up around the Lakeshore in central Wisconsin.
I also saw that there was guidance in this tool about, new construction on bluffs. And I just wondered if you've seen any of that guidance make its way into municipal code and ordinances for when there's like new, maybe residential construction in bluff areas.
That's a great question. I haven't seen any action taken on that yet, but I have, we've heard from those folks in municipalities that they do have questions about, setbacks is a big one. So how far away, you can be from the bluff edge. They're thinking about what that is and, for what it means for construction that's already there and what it means for new construction. So it is on their minds, but we haven't seen anything move forward yet. And as far as like codifying anything.
Cool. Yeah, setbacks. That was definitely on my mind. It's being talked about here too. Any more questions before we wrap up from our virtual audience? Okay, I'll have you stop sharing real quick, Lydia, your screen so I can just pop up a reminder.
Yes.
For those of us that are watching.
Here we go.
Thank you. Okay, so as a reminder, folks, office hours Wednesday, August 17th, 11 a.m. We'll just hold an open space for an hour. Feel free to drop in 5 minutes, the whole hour. Right at 11, at 11:30, we'll be there. And then look for details on a workshop coming up in September, where we'll continue on conversations on funding and finance, getting to more of those questions that Caroline was answering about funding for private properties, pooled bonds, collaborative approaches, and all those things that are at the top of your mind. So we look forward to seeing you soon, and you guys have a great summer. Thank you. Okay.